We often find ourselves caught in the whirlwind of time, rushing from one task to the next, desperate to see results, to feel progress, and to move forward. In this fast-paced world, the concept of waiting feels unnatural. When we ask something of God, we expect to see movement. We want to hear answers, sense change, witness doors opening. Yet, again and again, God invites us into a slower rhythm, into a divine tempo that doesn't respond to human urgency. His timing doesn't bow to our schedules, and though that may challenge us deeply, it also teaches us to trust in something greater than ourselves. God's timing, in truth, is not just different from ours, it is higher. It is wiser, it is perfect. While we live minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, God sees the entire canvas of our lives. He does not operate in fragments. He sees the end from the beginning and designs every step in love. We often think that delay means denial, that when something takes longer than expected, it must not be God's will. But in reality, God often delays not to punish or withhold, but to prepare, to align, and to protect. What we see as a detour is sometimes the safest, most merciful path God could lead us on. There are times when our hearts cry out, "Why not now, Lord?" And God, in His infinite compassion, whispers, "Because I love you too much to rush." Just like a good parent doesn't hand the keys of a car to a child who isn't ready to drive, God withholds what would harm us if given prematurely. His timing reflects His care, not His indifference. It takes faith to see that. Faith to believe that a delay can be a gift. Faith to trust that when nothing seems to be happening, everything is happening in ways we cannot yet see. In our desperation, we often try to make things happen on our own. We push doors that aren't ready to open. We chase answers instead of listening for direction. And in doing so, we sometimes exhaust ourselves and miss the peace that comes from surrendering to divine timing. When we try to rush what God is unfolding, we risk stepping ahead of His protection and provision. But when we learn to trust in His perfect pace, we begin to experience rest, not just physical rest, but soul rest. The kind that comes from knowing we are not the ones in control, and that's not a curse, it's a blessing. Think about the stories written in Scripture. Abraham waited decades for his promised son. Joseph endured years of suffering before rising to leadership in Egypt. Moses wandered the wilderness for 40 years before the promised land came into view. Jesus Himself waited 30 years before beginning His public ministry. In every one of these lives, God's timing proved perfect. Not a second too early, not a moment too late. The delays shaped their character, strengthened their faith, and made the fulfillment more powerful and beautiful than if it had come on their own timeline. So when life seems to slow down and your prayers echo back to you in silence, remember this: God's delay is not His denial. He is not bound by our urgency. He sees what we cannot. He is working on things we do not yet understand. And in His perfect time, what is meant to be will come to pass. The waiting is not wasted. The silence is not empty. The pace is not random. It is divine. And in that truth, we are invited to release our grip on time and rest in the One who holds all things, including us, in His loving hands. In a world that often equates waiting with weakness or stagnation, it can be difficult to understand that in God's plan, waiting is not wasting. Our culture teaches us that time must be filled with action, that productivity is proof of purpose. But the way of God does not mirror the ways of the world. His process often involves seasons of stillness, times when nothing on the surface appears to be moving, yet beneath the layers of quiet, transformation is taking place. The waiting seasons are some of the most sacred, though they are often misunderstood and undervalued. Consider a seed planted deep in the earth. For days, even weeks, there is no visible sign of life. But within the darkness of the soil, something holy is happening. Roots are taking shape, the environment is being navigated, foundations are forming. The seed cannot rush this process, nor can it skip any steps. If it sprouts too soon, it may not survive. If it breaks through the soil before it's strong enough, the wind may uproot it. This image mirrors our spiritual journeys. Sometimes God plants a dream, a purpose, or a promise in the soil of our hearts, and it feels like nothing is happening. But in truth, the most critical work is being done beneath the surface. We may look at others who seem to be flourishing, who appear to have answers, breakthroughs, and direction, and we may question why our lives feel paused or overlooked. But what we must understand is that God is not comparing timelines. He does not look at our lives and evaluate them based on what someone else is experiencing. Each soul is on a unique path with a unique pace. When we trust in God's process, we come to see that the waiting seasons are not delays in destiny. They are necessary intervals of growth. There is refinement that takes place in waiting. In those quiet moments, God often confronts our impatience, our fears, and our misconceptions about Him. He shows us areas of our lives that need healing, attitudes that need to shift, and beliefs that need to be surrendered. Waiting becomes the furnace where pride is melted, where self-sufficiency is dismantled, and where deeper dependence on Him is born. These inner workings are essential for the fulfillment of any promise. If we do not allow the process to shape us, we risk mishandling the very blessings we've prayed for when they arrive. In waiting, we are also given the chance to build intimacy with God. When everything around us is quiet, when we are not distracted by noise or achievement, we begin to hear His voice more clearly. We begin to seek Him not for what He can give us, but for who He is. This shift in perspective draws us closer to His heart. The delay then becomes a doorway to deeper relationship, and the stillness becomes a sanctuary of trust. Many of the greatest moves of God begin in obscurity. Jesus was born in a manger, not a palace. David was anointed as king while tending sheep. Elijah heard God not in the earthquake or the fire, but in a gentle whisper. These moments remind us that God values the hidden places. He does not rush greatness. He does not hurry holiness. He allows it to form in secret, in silence, and in stillness. So if you find yourself in a season where you feel like you are waiting endlessly, take heart. You are not being forgotten. You are being formed. What looks like delay is often divine preparation. What feels like stagnation is actually sacred construction. The waiting is not wasted. God is using it to build something within you that will last, something that will stand when the winds come and the storms rise. Trust the unseen work. Trust the silence. Trust that even in the waiting, God is always working. In our human nature, there is a deep desire to be in control. We want to map out the course, predict the outcomes, and ensure that our plans unfold without disruption. This longing for control often spills into our spiritual lives as well. We may say we trust God, but secretly we want to manage how and when His promises are fulfilled. We want clarity before obedience. We want certainty before surrender, but genuine faith does not function on control. It thrives in trust. Trust requires letting go. It demands a relinquishing of the need to understand every detail or foresee every result. When we trust God's plan, we acknowledge that our wisdom is limited and His is infinite. We realize that while our perspective is bound by time and emotion, His view is eternal and perfect. It's not easy to release control. It can feel risky, even frightening. But that is precisely where faith is formed, in the tension between what we know and what we believe. The greatest examples of faith in Scripture came not from people who understood everything, but from those who trusted in spite of what they didn't understand. Abraham walked up a mountain prepared to sacrifice his son, trusting that God would provide. Mary said yes to an angel, not knowing how the world would respond to her divine pregnancy. Peter stepped out of a boat into the water, not because he could swim, but because Jesus had called him. None of these acts were rooted in control. They were anchored in trust. When we let go of the need to orchestrate every outcome, we create space for God to move in ways far greater than anything we could design. Control limits the possibilities to what we can imagine. Trust opens us up to divine surprises, and often God will wait until we've fully surrendered control before He acts, not because He enjoys seeing us struggle, but because He wants to build our faith. He wants to show us that He is trustworthy not just in theory, but in practice. There's a quiet strength in the person who has learned to trust. They don't panic when the door stays shut. They don't manipulate when the answer seems delayed. They don't rush ahead or lag behind. They move at the pace of grace. That kind of peace doesn't come from external circumstances. It comes from a heart that has yielded to God's will and timing. This surrender is not a passive act. It is an active declaration of faith. It says, "Lord, I choose to believe that you know better than I do. I choose to rest in your decisions even when they don't make sense to me." We often find ourselves exhausted, not because of the trials we face, but because of our resistance to trust. We wear ourselves out trying to fix what only God can heal, trying to force what only God can bring. Trust sets us free from this burden. It allows us to rest, even in the unknown. It gives us the courage to walk forward without all the answers, simply because we know who is walking with us. Trusting God does not mean we abandon responsibility. It means we do our part with diligence and leave the results in His hands. It means we pray with expectation, but hold outcomes loosely. It means we remain faithful even when we cannot see the fruit. This posture of trust honors God more than any strategy we could develop. It acknowledges Him as sovereign, wise, and good. When we stop trying to control everything, we discover a deeper truth. We were never meant to carry the weight of outcome. That burden belongs to God. Our role is to believe, obey, and wait, and in doing so, we not only free ourselves from anxiety, but allow our faith to grow strong, rooted not in what we see, but in the one we trust. When life becomes quiet and answers seem absent, we often interpret God's silence as abandonment. We wonder if our prayers are being heard or if we are somehow forgotten. In the moments where we long for a sign, a word, a breakthrough, and none seem to come, doubt begins to whisper. The human heart is fragile in these waiting periods. We look for affirmation, but the heavens feel still. Yet this silence, so misunderstood, is often one of the most profound expressions of God's presence. God is never absent. His silence is not evidence of His departure. It is often His way of inviting us into deeper faith, a faith that is not built on constant confirmation, but on trust in His character. In silence, He invites us to believe that He is working even when we cannot hear or see. It is in those seasons of stillness that our roots grow deep. Like a tree planted in winter, what seems dormant on the surface is actually rich with life beneath. The silence of God is not empty. It is full of divine activity that we are not yet ready to perceive. In fact, silence has always been part of the sacred process. Before God created light, there was a void. Before Jesus began His ministry, He lived 30 years in quiet preparation. Before His resurrection, there were 3 days of silence in the tomb. These were not moments of inactivity. They were moments of anticipation, of sacred preparation, of heaven's quiet craftsmanship at work. We often assume that if we cannot feel God, he must not be near. But our feelings, though powerful, are not the measure of his presence. God is not limited to our emotional state. He does not need to prove himself with constant signs. His presence is steady, faithful, and enduring, even when it is not loud. There is strength in stillness. There is growth in quiet. And there is divine love in moments when God speaks not through words, but through silence. In these seasons, God is not punishing us. He is shaping us. The silence becomes a refining fire, not to burn us, but to purify us. He strips away the distractions, the noise, the need for instant assurance, so that we might learn to cling to him with deeper trust. The silence teaches us that faith is not just believing when God is speaking clearly. It is believing when he seems quiet. It is in these spaces that our relationship with him moves from surface to substance. Silence also creates space for us to hear our own hearts. In the absence of external noise, we begin to face our own doubts, fears, and questions. We become aware of what we are truly depending on, whether it is God himself or just the things we've associated with him. Silence helps us to purify our faith, to separate it from superstition, routine, or emotional dependence. In that space, we rediscover that God is enough, not because he answers quickly, but because he is who he says he is. It is often after a long silence that God speaks the clearest. Like a soft whisper after a storm, his voice becomes unmistakable. The waiting sharpens our hearing, our spirit becomes more attentive, and when he moves, we recognize his hand without doubt. God's timing includes these periods of silence, not to test us cruelly, but to deepen us mercifully. He allows these quiet valleys so that when we emerge from them, we are stronger, more mature, and more anchored in him. We must learn not to fear the silence of God, but to reverence it, not to run from it, but to sit with it. In doing so, we learn to find peace in his presence, even when he does not speak. Because his silence is not void, it is a sacred pause before the fulfillment of a promise, the gentle breath before the breakthrough, and in that stillness he is nearer than we can imagine. Life has a way of moving quickly, often without giving us the time to reflect. We pass through one experience after another, constantly looking ahead, striving, hoping, planning. But there is something powerful about pausing to look back, not to dwell in regret or nostalgia, but to remember how far we've come and how faithful God has been. When we reflect on the past, especially the difficult seasons where nothing made sense, we begin to see a pattern of grace. We begin to understand that what once felt like confusion was actually divine orchestration, and what felt like delay was God's perfect design. There are moments we all can recall when we prayed for something with urgency, perhaps even with desperation, and God didn't respond in the way we expected. At the time, the silence felt painful. The delay felt like rejection. The unanswered prayer felt like absence. But later, sometimes weeks, sometimes years, we realized that God had a better plan. A plan that protected us, matured us, or opened a door we never imagined. This hindsight becomes one of the most faith-strengthening experiences in our spiritual walk. God, in his mercy, allows us to live through seasons that later testify to his wisdom. A job we didn't get led to a better opportunity. A relationship that ended opened the path to healing and true connection. A move that didn't happen kept us close to someone who needed us, or led us into a purpose we would have otherwise missed. At the time, these redirections were painful, but with time we came to see that they were not punishments, they were divine interventions. When we take the time to remember these things, something changes in our perspective. Our current waiting seasons are no longer filled with panic, but with peace. If God was faithful then, he will be faithful now. If he turned confusion into clarity once, he can do it again. This reflective practice becomes a source of strength in moments when the future feels uncertain. Instead of allowing fear to dictate our reactions, we can rest in the evidence of God's past goodness. The Bible is filled with moments where God calls his people to remember. After the flood, he gave Noah a rainbow as a reminder. When the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, they were instructed to build a memorial with stones from the riverbed to remind future generations of God's faithfulness. Jesus himself, before his death, gave his disciples bread and wine and said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Memory, when guided by faith, is not just sentimental. It is sacred. It grounds us. It reminds us that the God who was faithful yesterday is the same today and will be forever. Even the most painful chapters in our lives can become part of a greater story of redemption. The tears we cried were not wasted. The nights we spent wondering why were not in vain. God was working through it all. His timing may not have aligned with ours, but his purpose never failed. And now, those same stories we once wanted to erase become testimonies we share with others. Our past becomes someone else's encouragement. Our waiting becomes someone else's hope. So when we find ourselves in a new season of uncertainty, it's not always about figuring out the next step. Sometimes it's about remembering the last time we didn't know what to do and how God made a way. It's about drawing courage from history, not fear from the unknown. The same hand that held us then is holding us now. The same heart that cared for us in silence is still listening. We don't always need new signs. We often just need to remember the ones we've already seen. In our striving to see promises fulfilled and prayers answered, we often fall into the trap of thinking that the more we do, the more likely we are to move God's hand. We work harder, we worry more, and we live with a tension in our hearts that subtly says, "If I don't make this happen, it won't happen." But this mindset is not rooted in faith. It's rooted in fear. Fear that God won't come through. Fear that time is running out. Fear that somehow his plan won't be enough. But the truth of the matter is this: peace doesn't come from struggle. It comes from surrender. God never asked us to carry the full weight of our lives. He did not design us to bear the burden of outcomes. He simply invites us to trust, to rest in his care, to live with a posture of open hands rather than clenched fists. When we learn to surrender, to truly let go and place our desires, our worries, and our timing into his hands, we experience a peace that surpasses understanding. This surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is a recognition that God is God and we are not. We often confuse surrender with passivity, as if to surrender means to stop caring or stop trying. But that is not the kind of surrender God calls us to. Surrender is not the absence of action. It is the presence of trust. It is doing what we are called to do while leaving the results entirely to him. It is praying fervently, working diligently, loving deeply, and then resting, because we know that God is ultimately in control. When we release our need to force things, we begin to move in step with grace. There is freedom in this kind of surrender, freedom from anxiety, freedom from the pressure to always perform, freedom from the false idea that our worth is tied to how quickly things change or how visibly God is working. When we truly believe that God's timing is perfect and that his plan is for our good, we are able to live in peace, even when nothing seems to be changing on the outside. Our peace no longer depends on the situation, but on the one who holds every situation in his hands. This is the kind of peace that Jesus offered when he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He wasn't offering an escape from responsibility. He was offering an exchange, our heavy yoke for his light one, our frantic striving for his calm strength. When we come to him and surrender, we do not lose control. We gain perspective. We begin to see that God has been working all along, even in the waiting, even in the silence. So many of us are walking through life weary, not from external circumstances, but from internal wrestling. We wrestle with timelines, outcomes, decisions, and fears. We carry burdens that were never ours to carry. We try to make things happen in our strength, and then wonder why we are tired, discouraged, or anxious. The invitation of God is simple and powerful. Be still and know that I am God. That stillness is not inactivity. It is a quiet confidence in His sovereignty. As we grow in trust, we also grow in peace. We stop measuring our lives by what we can see and start measuring them by what we believe. We stop reacting to every delay as a disaster and start seeing them as divine pauses. We begin to live with joy in the moment rather than stress about the future. This is the fruit of surrender, a life marked not by striving, but by stillness, not by control, but by calm. And in this place of peace, we make room for God to move, not just around us, but within us,